We're going to give a few minutes for people to come in, and then we're going to get started. We're going to get started in just a minute here. So welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. The webinar series is a platform for CNU members to engage, debate, and collaborate on the pressing issues of the day. Today we have Public Works, the Walkable City in Oklahoma City with planner Jeff Speck and Public Works Director Eric Wenger, and discussion with yours truly, Rob Studeville. And register for our next webinar, which is Tuesday, December 14th at 12 noon Eastern Time. We have an author's forum on a book, La Città Sana, the Healthy City, the New Garden City for the Post-COVID-19 World. Italian architect Gabriele Tagliavente discusses his new book that explains the healthy city, its development starting from the Spanish flu pandemic, and responses from the Garden City, passing through the experience of the urban villages and pocket neighborhoods up to the 15-minute city. Go to cnu.org/resources/on-the-park-bench. And I wanted to let everybody know about Oklahoma City, CNU 30 in Oklahoma City, which the registration starts tomorrow, December 1st. And CNU 30 is going to be March 23rd through 26th, 2022. And it's going to be CNU's first in-person Congress since 2019. Everybody's looking forward to that. We've had some great success with virtual congresses, but it's not quite the same as meeting your colleagues and hearing directly from people who are making a difference in urban design and development across the country and worldwide, walking the city, meeting your friends, having a drink at the bar with some of the best planners anywhere, and witnessing firsthand a city's renaissance. Oklahoma City has had some fantastic things that have happened over the last 10 or 20 years. And we're going to be talking about some of them today. So learn more, cnu.org/CNU30. And we've got a great show today. Jeff Speck needs very little introduction to the CNU audience or the urban planning audience. His name is almost synonymous with walkability. He's the author of Walkable City Rules and Walkable City and co-author of Suburban Nation. And he is principal of Speck and Associates, which has done and been involved in some of the most significant plans for cities around the country over the last 14 years. And prior to his private practice, he was director of design at the National Endowment for the Arts, presiding over the Mayor's Institute on City Design. Eric Wenger is director of public works for Oklahoma City, a city of 681,000. He has been director of public works for 10 years. He's overseen major improvements in the walkability and public realm of the city's downtown and surrounding neighborhoods. Jeff and Eric have lots to talk about in terms of the transformation of Oklahoma City, as Jeff did the plan for a walkability plan for Oklahoma City that was implemented, Project 180. And they have, and we'll also be discussing how public works plays into walkable cities in general. I'm Rob Studeville, editor of CNews Public Square. I'm the interviewer today. We're going to have a brief presentation from both Jeff and Eric, followed by a discussion with me, followed by Q&A from the audience. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. And now I'll pass this off to Jeff.
Hey, Rob, thanks for having me. I just want to thank you for all the good work that you do. And I'm recalling that we've probably been doing this together since around 1995. I think I met you at CNU 3 or 4. I know I definitely talked to you at 4 when we signed the charter. But thank you for all you do and for being really the premier, from the very beginning, the premier promulgator of the Congress's ideas and best practices. Remember New Urban News? How could we forget? And Eric, I'm honored to join you today. Really looking forward to this. I have a lot to say, and I always plan to say more than I have time for, so that means I'm going to talk really fast. But this is a quick crowd. This is a New Urbanist crowd, so I can speed myself up and nothing will be lost. I'm going to share my desktop and maximize my show. Try not to give too much away before I start. So I present, all over the place, internationally, nationally, and a project I always present, albeit in a shorter version than today, is Project 180, and specifically what grew out of the walkability study for downtown Oklahoma City. It was one of the first projects I did in my own firm. When I left the NEA in 2007, I believe this work was in 2010, maybe started a bit earlier. I think it started actually maybe 2007, even 2008. Rob, the one aspect of my bio you didn't mention is that I spent 10 years at DPZ. So most of what I learned when I went to the NEA and that I still use in my practice, I learned from Andres Dwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, and those of you who haven't heard me present before will hear echoes of their thinking in this presentation. So this is what Oklahoma City looked like in 2008. Many of its streets looked like this one, although this was probably the worst. It was a city that had been designed along a redesigned around a very autocentric modernist plan. Most of what IMP proposed back in the mid 60s in the downtown was not built, thank goodness, as he proposed it. But the autocentric nature of his plans were very much embraced as the city moved forward in the second half of the 20th century. And so my favorite image is this one, although this is a bus station, it's not just for cars, but the idea that cars were the heart of the city, and the city was sized around many more cars than it ended up holding. And the actual gap between the number of cars that the city was welcoming and the number of cars that it was actually experiencing turned out to be great fodder for changing the design of the downtown streets, but initially was a source of panic when Prevention Magazine, and I don't have the date on this, but I'm going to guess it's around 2009. Prevention Magazine called Oklahoma City the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country. So that was what the mayor was faced with. Mayor Cornett, who I had met at the Mayor's Institute on City Design, approached me when this came out and said, "What can we do?" And I said, "Well, let's do a walkability study." And he said, "What's that?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, but let's figure it out together." And the first thing we did was we looked at the car counts in the downtown core. And you can see from this image of 6,000 and 9,000, 11,000, 8,000, 5,000, 3,000. These are very low car counts. Any engineer will tell you that who hasn't been brainwashed at least, that a 2-lane street can easily handle 10,000 cars per day. And that's 2 lanes without center turn lanes, which make the street have a lot greater throughput. So you had all these streets that had car counts at or less, mostly less than 10,000 cars per day, and yet they were typically sized as 4 lanes or more, 4 lanes, 5 lanes, some 6-lane streets. They were designated arterials in the city's most recent downtown plan, and they were designated to be maintained or remade or repaved at 4 to 6 lanes. And I said, wow, you've got this big disconnection here, you know, where Sheridan could be comfortably at the threshold, could be 2 lanes, Hudson, Robinson, Fourth, you know, these were the car counts, and yet they were sized to be so much larger, right? Such as Hudson, which is the worst of the bunch. So that was one thing, just the number of lanes. Another thing that we had started discovering around the same time, and Alan Ehrenholt, a well-known writer, came out with this now pretty famous article in Governing Magazine, was about how destructive one-way streets were to safety, but also to business vitality. He told the story of Vancouver, Washington, where they had tried, you know, the 6 Bs of the 80s to bring this street back to life. The bricks, the berms, the banners, the balloons, the bollards, and the bandstands. Nothing brought the street back to life until, as you see in the picture, they reverted it to 2-way traffic. The DOT reluctantly gave in and allowed that to happen. The street was a great success story after that, as told in this article. In Walkable City, I talk about East Broad Street in Savannah, where Christian Sotil did a study and found that in 1969, when it was converted to one-way, 64% of the businesses just disappeared. It was reverted back to 2-way in 1990, and almost immediately half of 50% more businesses came back, and that's improved to today. That's a story of business. A story of safety. In Louisville, Kentucky, Brooks, First, Second, and Third were all one-way streets, and they actually converted Brook and First back to 2-way, and they left Second and Third as one-way. On the 2-ways, car crashes dropped 48%, crime went down. On the 1-ways, crashes went up, crime went up. And there's story after story, and many of them are happening in places where I've worked. Across the river from Louisville, this was our plan for New Albany, Indiana. And they actually executed on this. They did it. They've reverted the whole downtown back to 2-way traffic. And with great results. Some of you may have toured this with me when the CNU was in Louisville. And then another plan that I've worked on for Cedar Rapids, where we turned this downtown into this downtown, reverting all the one-way streets back to 2-way. And this was done after Oklahoma City, when we were a little more progressive about bike lanes. Yes, this person is learning not to park in the bike lane, but you get the idea. Anyway, what happened when my walkability study was completed for downtown Oklahoma City is that this tower was about to be built in the downtown core by Devon Energy. It was going to create about $200 million in tax increment. And they were asking the question, what should we spend this money on? And they pretty quickly reached the conclusion, as shown in this plan by OJB, the Office of Jim Burnett, who was the prime and I was a sub. Let's rebuild our streetscapes and our streets of essentially our 50-block downtown core, from building face to building face across every street. And my job was actually to do the curb to curb. So street by street in the downtown, I did a plan that essentially eliminated almost half of the driving lanes and eliminated almost all of Eric can confirm, maybe all of the one-way streets, replaced driving lanes with parking lanes, replaced them with bike lanes, essentially doubled the amount of on-street parking, and created a rudimentary bike network. And then that plan was rejected. And this is the story I don't usually have the time to tell, but it's told pretty well by Laura Story. And Laura Story was the project manager for this exercise. And because I recently did another walkability study in Tulsa, I asked her to create a memo, and she created a 4-page memo of what happened in this project. And she's now retired, but she was the program manager for this effort, and God bless her because she had some nerve. TEC, which was the city's consultant, which analyzes all of their traffic efforts, looked at the scope, which of course had two-way traffic and narrower driving lanes and bike lanes and smaller turning radii and a preference to the pedestrian. Public Works engineering staff accepted the report, intended to move forward. The initial results reflected unacceptable level of service on the proposed grid system. Public Works, before Eric's time, accepted the report. However, project scope, so their revision would have added turn lanes and a third lane in many situations. However, project scoping decisions required all departments to accept the proposal. Planning staff objected, and the planning staff and consultants presented information about how it could be. There's a lot more to say, but the key takeaway from this page that I want to share with you is that Laura joined us in putting her foot down and saying, essentially, if it doesn't have more than 10,000 cars per day, then it shouldn't have a middle turn lane. And then we got Troy Russ, a longtime Gladding Jackson employee, and now his on. I believe he may work for Kimley Horn now, but Troy Russ, who was at that point independent, I think for $5,000, prepared an alternative traffic study that showed that we only needed to add a couple little left-hand turn lanes and that it wouldn't fail. And reluctantly, the city accepted that study, and we were able to go forward. So most of what I had planned was executed, or at least was accepted and perhaps eventually executed. And then I want to just quote Laura in her experience in working on this, saying, the city has exploded with new recreation, entertainment, and eating venues. The demographics of our city have changed so much with the influx of young adults starting their careers. Downtown feels alive and Metropolitan. I believe this increased activity level has in large part been due to the downtown infrastructure reconstruction. So to have an engineer come forward and say that makes me very happy. It was a battle. It's now some images. Here's a typical street as it was before. Here's how it changed. Here it is under construction. Here's one of the streets that just lost a lane. So Park Ave was a 3-lane street essentially, and here it is rebuilt as a 2-lane street, wider sidewalks, narrower 10-foot travel lanes. Here's one of several that went from 1-way to 2-way. Harvey Ave, you can see it's basically a 3-lane 1-way before. Here it is a lovely 2-lane 2-way with wider sidewalks. By the way, if we were to do this today, we wouldn't have the center yellow stripe in there. Recent studies show that a yellow stripe in the middle of the road adds about 7 miles an hour to people's speeds, and when you remove it, they go slower. But it's clearly a much better street. Robinson Avenue is a 4-lane 1-way with probably, I don't know, 8,000 cars per day on it. It's now a 2-lane 2-way and holds the streetcar that was built in the center of Oklahoma City as well. Here's one of the main arterials through the downtown Sheridan before and after. This is one of the streets that bike lanes were added. And, you know, this was done at a time when protected bike lanes, let's just say that I wasn't using them yet. We would do this differently now and protect the bikes, but at least there's a bike lane in the street. And that's the idea. So that's, you know, I always tell other cities, this is what you do if you have money. If you don't have money, you can do most of it just with paint. But of course, the other thing that Oklahoma City got out of it was a much improved landscape and wonderful trees that you'll see when you go there. I wanted to end, and I know Eric will be talking mostly about the downtown and Project 180, but I wanted to talk with about a less success of a story, which is the Boulevard, which I also struggled with when I did my my walkability study, because this was the news. Oklahoma City is going to swap a highway for a park, and this is 2008, around the time I was beginning my walkability study there. And the idea now executed is that this highway that used to run through the center of downtown would be shifted all new to a trench south of downtown, which would allow it essentially from Bricktown all the way west to this area to become a normal city street and not have to carry that much traffic, and certainly not have to carry it at speed. So here's what it looked like before. And this was the plan that I encountered when I was doing my walkability study. And I said, well, this isn't the worst, but it certainly isn't a park. And what would it look like if it were a park? And in my walkability study, I proposed a solution, 2 lanes in each direction, but a true park strip in the center as an alternative. Then, and Eric knows this story, then the state DOT, and here's the key point, the state DOT's deal with the city was, yes, we will give it back to you. We will revert this thoroughfare to city ownership, but we're going to design and build it first. And this is what we arrived at. This is what I arrived at when I was invited to the first meeting on the design of the boulevard. So you can see how the park becomes, the idea of a park becomes not so much of a park, becomes in the hands of the state DOT, just another massive highway. And Eric's going to talk about how much better we made it, or they made it, than what was actually going to happen without the severe intervention of the city. But I kind of, I gave it my best shot and tried to educate the design team, most of which were outside consultants, about the difference between highways and boulevards in terms of volume, speed, throughput versus access, and safety achieved not through minimizing conflicts, but as Alan Jacobs will tell you in the Boulevard book, by maximizing the potential for conflict, which is what makes cities safe. How the lanes need to be narrower, how you need more on-street parking, and prismatic geometries as opposed to streamform geometries, tighter curb radii, tighter sight triangles, lots of intersections, lots of trees. What distinguishes these things? Because as Andre Stoani always says, a boulevard creates real estate value while a highway sunders real estate value. So let's build a boulevard and not a highway. And this ended up being my proposal. And zooming in a bit, this plan then was mostly trees, still 2 lanes in each direction, but a giant park in the center. That was not successful. Let's just say it was not successful. This is not what all of it looks like, but if you go there today, what you see is not particularly park-like. It's not particularly boulevard-like. And Eric can talk about how it's better than what it was, but I do feel that there was a disappointing outcome, and leaving us with this lesson, which is do not let the DOT design the street before they hand it over, a lesson they are learning exceptionally painfully in Seattle, where you may be aware they buried the Alaskan Way, and they buried it, they replaced it with an incredibly expensive multi-billion-dollar tunnel, which is underneath the old Alaskan Way. And here's the new Alaskan Way, because they let the DOT do it. So I think there's a big lesson there. It's not always your choice as a city, but don't think you're going to get a park when you let the DOT replace your highway with a quote unquote street. But it could have been worse. And that's my segue now to bow out and hand it over to Eric, who's going to talk both about some of the things they managed to save, but then about downtown and Oklahoma City in general. So I'll stop my share and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate it also, Rob, for the invitation today. And I think really just to pick up where Jeff left off, I've been the director, as Rob mentioned, for Public Works here in Oklahoma City for 10 years. And I didn't come in with a lot of the preconceived notions of maybe what other Public Works directors had experienced coming up through their careers. So it left a lot of room for imagination. One of the first projects that I was introduced to was Project 180. And so to really just pick up a little bit of this discussion and to get this going here just real quick. Jeff was correct. I mean, it was a project that began in 2008. And as we looked at Prevention Magazine, Oklahoma City was ranked 500 out of 500 cities on walkable cities. So there was definitely issues in Oklahoma City, but let's not forget, I mean, Oklahoma City was a booming city in the 1980s with the oil industry. It was when the oil bust that a lot of the buildings were vacated that really put us in the state that it is in. It required all the one-way streets at a time, but obviously a huge change when Devon Energy decided to locate their corporate headquarters downtown. And again, when I started working for the city almost 30 years ago, Oklahoma City downtown was a city with a number of stoplights that simply flashed red at 5 o'clock because there was no traffic. They were designed for just a different era. But with Project 180, we did have an ability to convert roadways, as Jeff mentioned, from one-way to two-way, bikeability, on-street parking, enhancing pedestrian zones, and of course, a lot of landscaping and lighting. It's $180 million. It was originally forecasted for over 180 acres. And this is some of the typical cross sections that, again, as we worked with the office of James Burnett, using a lot of the study information that Jeff showed, really returning to complete street concepts like you see here. And this is definitely a model that was used throughout our downtown area. Similar picture that Jeff showed, this is the fully grown and built out Reno Avenue. This was a high capacity street that now is served by 2 lanes in each direction, 11-foot driving lanes, lots of landscaping that is fully matured, different than really a concrete city that it was before. You'll see a lot of the decorative lighting features that are now throughout downtown with a lot of those amenities. But it really did not end there. When Project 180 wrapped up, Public Works Department, Oklahoma City works very, very closely now with the planning department. And what came out of that, of course, is our Bike Walk OKC master plan, which is a part of the city's comp plan. This is some of the P180 streets here that are in front of our city hall. This is Walker Avenue that was a 4-lane thoroughfare before. What you see now is parking, bike lane, and then a vehicle lane in each direction. We've been really fortunate in Oklahoma City with funding opportunities. So when Project 180 funds were completely utilized, we've entered into a nearly $1 billion Better Street, Safer City program. We've also had our MAPS 3 initiative, and then we're now launching into MAPS 4. And MAPS, for those that are part of this webinar, it's Metropolitan Area Projects. It's a program that began back in 1993 with the first MAPS. It's a 1-cent sales tax that's basically been maintained in Oklahoma City since inception, and it's building major facilities. Back to Bike Walk, we again completely reimagined not just the downtown area, but we've reached out into other neighborhood districts. This is Western Avenue north of downtown that was formerly 4 lanes, now converted to 2 lanes, using medians, using chicanes, using bulb outs, using all those things to reduce those crossing distances. We're now in the midst of redoing our Paseo district. Again, a lot of the same features, landscaping, narrower lanes, improvements, connectivity to bus stops. And what's becoming more and more common here in Oklahoma City, it doesn't matter what kind of street that we're working on. As we look at Bike Walk and the bike master plan that's providing connectivity throughout Oklahoma City, every street that we design now that's a part of that bike plan is being reconsidered for reconfiguration. So you're finding now on a lot of the city's major arterial streets, nowhere in the downtown area. This is going to be in Southeast Oklahoma City on Southeast 59th. We're looking at more than 4 lanes of bikeable, protected bike lanes connecting to some of the area trail systems. So use of a lot of the Project 180 details is now expanded immensely out. We continue to build sidewalks, sidewalking connectivity. Our trail system continues to expand. Again, all a part of the Bike Walk plan. There's over 100 miles of linked trail in Oklahoma City. And then we continue to build out downtown even after 180. You're now starting to see the emergence of protected bike lanes downtown where we've got the ability to start adding those now. So you're starting to see these buffer areas included. We're actually providing some delineators on several of our streets. This was, again, a 4-lane section of Walker Avenue. You can see downtown in the distance, providing that connectivity with delineators and buffer zones and bike lanes on each side. And then, of course, in a lot of our connector streets. So a lot of change in Oklahoma City since 2008, and it's not over. This is our recently opened, a little over a year ago, Scissortail Park. It provides for bikeability, walkability, and this is adjacent to that boulevard that was mentioned that has been redesigned. And the boulevard just recently been completed. A lot of the landscaping is just not quite as mature yet, but we are expecting it to be fully grown out here in the next several years. But you can imagine the new boulevard, especially with the conference here in Oklahoma City in the spring, start emerging more and more as more like a Reno Avenue. This is going to be the view from the convention center, which the conference is being held at. And this is the Scissortail Park immediately to the west. This is, again, just one more of those views as we show some of those connected items. So with that, Oklahoma City's come a really, really long way. There's a lot of partnering in Oklahoma City, not just with our 2 departments of Public Works and our planning department, but a lot of stakeholders. We reach out to the community, business owners for input. There's just a lot of collaboration that just did not exist many, many years ago, and it's become our new normal. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Rob. And again, happy to participate today. So thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric and Jeff, for your presentations. And you gave a lot of details on that. I'll try not to be repetitive with these questions, but just to go into it a little bit deeper, Jeff, I think that I saw where you said that this was one of your favorite projects or your favorite project that you've done. And I wanted to ask, like, what makes it so special in comparison to other downtown transformations?
Well, it was just so bad. So with apologies to Eric and no apologies needed because he wasn't responsible. I think the Oklahoma City that we both inherited more than a decade or more than a decade ago had been just reshaped entirely around driving. The expression, well, you're not going to get the cowboy off his horse, was something that I heard a lot out there. And the willingness, well, I think what makes it one of my favorites is how hard it was. And the fact that we were able to largely succeed in a context of getting stiff-armed by the traffic consultants. And then the city's surprising, can I say that? Because at this time, more than a decade ago, there weren't that many cities that were flexible. But the city's surprising willingness to overrule their, well-paid traffic consultants and listen to us instead, because planning really raised a stink, and I had raised a pretty public stink, and there's a lot of battles we lose. So when you win, it's really special. I feel a little ambivalent with everyone coming to Oklahoma City. This is a project that's a decade old or a little more, and it's taken that long to build it out. So on the one hand, we get the experience of seeing something that's been completed as opposed to something that's, under construction and mostly cones. And that's a benefit. But I have to say that as Eric showed in some of his more recent plans, we really weren't up to best practices, for example, with bike infrastructure. And so I think folks who come and again, with apologies to Oklahoma City, folks who come to Oklahoma City from San Francisco or New York or other cities that have been really progressive for longer might not be as impressed as they otherwise might be. But if you're coming from a city that's more normal, right, and less of a trendsetter, you're gonna see an amazing amount that was accomplished in a reasonably short period of time.
And I think especially for those that maybe were in Oklahoma City just a few short years ago, or maybe as much as 10 years ago, it's a completely transformed city. So obviously encouraging you to come back and visit. There's, as we speak about just the downtown area, there are just a lot of things even in near downtown and outside of downtown that have remarkably changed as well. So huge transformation.
Talking a little bit, you guys both talked a bit about the history, especially Jeff, but I wanted to ask a question with regard to public works. And if you go back 100 years, there were magnificent places to walk around in cities in North America, and that was all about public works. And when you had Chicago, the Burnham Plan and what they built is an example, but many cities as well. And then public works became more interested in cars, forgetting about the human scale. then in recent years, we've had a shift in that attitude. But looking specifically about how public works, how do we sort of return to a full view of public works as being about the public realm? Has that happened in Oklahoma City, and how can that happen elsewhere?
Sure. So, Oklahoma City is really different than a lot of cities, especially when we look at comparables. So Oklahoma City, population of over 600,000. One of the things that we're still the largest in is by land area. So we're still over 600 square miles in city area. So our city is diverse even in the way that it's laid out. So when we talk about the urban core, we do follow a certain design principle and standard that's highly walkable, a lot of bikeability. But then as we move outside of Oklahoma City and we get into suburban Oklahoma City, again, we're still pushing a very walkable, bikeable environment, but you don't see the same need for on-street parking in neighborhoods as you do in, say, the downtown core. As we reach out even another tier and we look at a lot of the rural areas of Oklahoma City, I mean, there are places in Oklahoma City that you can still buy 5-acre parcels and have a home, or a 40-acre farm if that's what you prefer. And we really have a different design model for that. So I think you find a really capable public works, one that looks at the city based on the needs of the certain parts of the city. We design to the need, but I'll go back to, it really has a lot of stakeholder input. So, we find that even on the walkable side, we're in neighborhoods, prepared, funded, plans in hand, ready to build sidewalks. And certain neighborhoods have actually put petitions together and asked Oklahoma City not to construct those sidewalks in those neighborhoods. And we honor that. Now, I would say that that's not the norm, but we have had several applications received that we've honored. But for the most part, we continue to build hundreds and hundreds of miles of sidewalks in Oklahoma City that have not been built in decades. We continue to launch out with new bike connectivities, trails, and all those things that we've shown that really began with the P180 story.
I think Eric brings up an important distinction between the suburban city and the urban city. Oklahoma City and other cities like it, particularly in that region, their statistics are bad, largely because they've absorbed their suburbs. So it's almost not fair. I think probably when Oklahoma City was called the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country, it's because they were looking at statistics across the entire city. And if you look at a city like Oklahoma City that's absorbed its suburbs versus a city like Philadelphia that hasn't, the data is vastly different than what it would be if, for example, Philadelphia's suburbs were counted in the averages that determine outcomes. So, for example, most urban places, truly urban pre-war places in the U.S., are losing about 5 people per 100,000 per year in traffic crashes. Most suburban places are losing closer to 20 people per 100,000 per year in traffic crashes. The U.S. average is around 11. But that average of 11 is a melding of suburban data and urban data. And a city like Oklahoma City, by including its suburbs, is going to end up always looking a lot worse than it really is. But of course, there's a deeper lesson, which is why I brought the data up, which is that suburban places are extraordinarily deadly for drivers and also especially for pedestrians.
I wanted to ask you both if you've seen much change in the thinking about public spaces and streets in the field of public works, especially, and how you can encourage public works departments to care about walkable cities.
Yeah, that's a great question for Eric, and I'll let him take it. But let me just quickly say that there are certain public works directors who care and a whole bunch that don't. I was following, I think he might have changed positions, but I was following a guy named Dong Ho Chang, who you guys may know, on Twitter for a while. I think he was the Seattle public works director or some aspect, maybe city engineer. Every day he would tweet out some bike box that they've installed or some protected bike lane or some, neck down intersection. And there's this new generation of people, at the municipal level who actually make it their mission to improve pedestrian safety and bicycle safety. I remember I showed up in San Jose. This was probably about 5 years ago. I showed up in San Jose and I was blown away by the downtown of San Jose, the bike lanes, the trams, certain details. And it really felt like Europe. And I asked my tour guide, what's going on here? And he said, well, you know, Jeff, you know how in every city there's the city engineer, and then in every city there's also that guy or gal who spends every summer in the Netherlands and is a total bike fanatic and only takes transit and refuses to drive. And well, in San Jose, that's the same person. And I was like, okay. So I think, you know, as I think guys like me get older, guys like us get older, I'm hopeful there's a new generation of public works folks even after us who make this who are missionaries for this kind of stuff.
I think from my perspective, I think I kind of talked about it earlier. I did not come in with a preconceived notion as a public works director. Being an engineer, licensed engineer, I'm also the city engineer. There was really pretty much a demand on my position from the council level, from the mayor, from the city manager, that I absolutely develop a relationship with our planning department and get more involved. I think something that has changed in Oklahoma City is just that. I'm now working with our third planning director since becoming the public works director. Russell Klaus was the planning director at the time Project 180 was first implemented. And I will say that we did not agree on a lot of things. It took a lot of education on my part. I think it took some understanding on his part for us to meet in the middle, but I felt like we did that. It's a little bit sad when he chose to leave because I felt like I finally had met him and we had that relationship going forward. But I worked then very closely with our second planning director, Aubrey Hammondtree, now Aubrey McDermott, and that has thrived. And now I'm working with Jeff Butler. But I would just tell you that it takes a real conversation that doesn't just come up project to project. For Jeff and I, sometimes it's a daily conversation, whether it's about bikes or walkability. It's having me become more educated in the world of planning and some of those things that engineers just typically don't dive into. And I've chosen to do that. And it's provided for a lot better response when we have multiple departments that can respond to our city council and our mayor and our manager on successes. And it doesn't always mean that the public works director caves in, you know, to all the requests that maybe come from an urbanist standpoint. There is still some engineering that's required that has to be done. There's certain things related to safety, access, connectivity that we have to work through. But Jeff and I have done, I think, a really good job for Oklahoma City in putting forth a model for all those different transit-oriented features to move successfully forward in Oklahoma City. But it's a real and a daily conversation that has to happen.
I wanted, before I get to the Q&A, I wanted to ask, what were some of the specific lessons that you learned along the way in terms of taking that plan to implementation? And Jeff, I wanted to ask you what you learned that you have then taken to other cities.
So let me start quickly. I think the one that in Oklahoma City that has been probably the most significant is the reduction in our lane widths. Especially when Project 180 first was conceived, you know, most Oklahoma City streets were 13 and 14-foot lane widths. And there was this conversation, oh, let's drop them down to 10 feet, it'll work. And we're given a list of cities that these 10-foot lanes existed in. You know, we looked at a lot of things locally. We looked at, you know, in Oklahoma City is a little bit different. There is a slightly bigger vehicle here in Oklahoma City than in traditional cities, maybe urban cities, but we did settle in on 11-foot lanes. And we use those now citywide. We use those citywide at certain speed limit ranges. We use those not just in our downtown urban core, but we're finding that we use those on a lot of our arterial and our collector streets now that just hadn't been done before. But it came with experience. We had to try it and do a pilot project to show that they worked, convinced ourselves that they would function for Oklahoma City, but it's become our new standard. So we've taken several feet out of lane widths in Oklahoma City, and it again, it's our new standard forward.
And I'll just do my job of always pushing the envelope, Eric, and say that they should be 9 feet wide.
I knew you were going to say that.
And that, you know, the NACDO, you know, every city you try for what you can and you get what you get. And 11 feet in Oklahoma City was a real accomplishment. The NACDO standard that they've put forward now is 10 feet and they allow 11 for bus lanes. And most transit agencies will ask for 11. I've had some success pushing for 10 comprehensively in cities. And I point out those places where the lanes are even narrower. You know, my theory is that if two vehicles, which even the dualies, right, are only maybe 8 feet wide, if two vehicles can pass each other and not cause a, not shut the street down by rubbing fenders, then the narrower the better, because we want to see people going, very slow speeds in the downtown core. The main thing that I started to develop in Oklahoma City that I learned from that experience that has then kind of blossomed into a more comprehensive technique is what I would call the downtown lane audit. So Oklahoma City was the first of what's now added up to about 16 walkability studies that I've done for American downtowns in the last dozen years. And each walkability study includes in it this idea of a lane audit, which is where you count every lane. We're arguing about induced demand and how actually the amount of traffic that we experience will be an outcome of the number of lanes that we provide, but that's a very weak political stance. It's very hard to win arguments on the concept of induced demand in almost any American city. And so the strategy we use, as I discussed in my presentation, is we find places where actually there are more lanes than the current traffic does demand. And you can find those in every city, even quite congested cities. So how many lanes? How wide are the lanes, as Eric suggested? Is there parallel, what are the other things that will cause traffic to go more slowly? Is there parallel parking, right? Are there bike lanes? Is it one-way versus two-way travel? Something that I don't think I was yet understanding in the Oklahoma City study, which I've brought to almost every subsequent study, is trading signalized intersections for stop sign intersections. Because actually, if you have an intersection which is not overwhelmed with a ton of traffic, replacing a signal with a stop sign will, in the one time it's been tested, and it was tested very thoroughly in Philadelphia across 200 signals, it'll reduce injury crashes by more than 50%. So a typical audit also includes that. And the typical plan I do for a downtown might eliminate half of the signals in favor of stop signs. So, it's a series of techniques that have just grown and grown over the years. This idea of eliminating center lines to get people to drive slower. There's probably legitimately 30 different things you can do, and more cities are starting to do them.
Although Oklahoma City hasn't done a replacement of signal with a stop sign, I see one of the chat questions is about roundabouts. We have looked at roundabouts in several instances. We actually looked at one on the boulevard, and I had hoped it had more promise. It just did not provide for the engineering. We even hired an independent planning engineering firm to study it for us. And we did end up with just a grade separated crossing at this location that I'm speaking of. But we have successfully completed our latest roundabout project that's adjacent to the Scissortail Park. It's in our urban core on Robinson Avenue at Southwest 7th, and it's adjacent to our convention center that is recently opened. So Oklahoma City definitely is continuing to look at roundabout options. We're starting to explore those also to retrofit, hopefully into neighborhood settings as well. If not to just improve circulation, but also to possibly remove some of those stop signs. But roundabouts are a possibility in Oklahoma City, and I do expect that we may see a few more in the downtown area.
Well, I'm a fan of roundabouts, but not in the heart of downtown, not where you've got where you want to have a static pedestrian-oriented shopping environment. I like to say that roundabouts are the safest, most pedestrian-friendly automotive environment that you can create. But they take pedestrians off axis. They're tremendously safe. But they are an environment of dynamic motion, not one of stasis that you really want to have. One of my clients, a brilliant man, is Jim Brainerd, who was featured on the front page of the New York Times last weekend for the 140 roundabouts that he's built in Carmel, Indiana, where I'm working with him. And I approve of almost every roundabout that he's done because they tend to be in suburban locations on the edges of things. I wouldn't put it right in the heart of a CBD.
are there certain things with roundabouts that you can do to make them more or less pedestrian friendly? And I mean, can roundabouts be badly done or better done? And how do you go about that? I mean, I don't want to get into something that's too specific, but
I think that the modern roundabout as it's currently practiced and when it's implemented these days is about as good as it's going to get, and it's not bad at all. It's very safe, and it's it has other benefits in terms of noise and pollution and other things. Here in New England we have what's called a rotary, which is a traffic circle of pretty high speed. That's a different model, but I think the techniques right now in terms of making them safe and welcoming are pretty darn good. The problem is that they don't really create the sort of social environment in which you're likely to see a ton of people hanging out, stopping, shopping, that sort of thing. So they're great for everywhere except those main intersections where you want to have urban life.
One of our existing roundabouts in Oklahoma City was at Northwest 10th and Walker. And I think, as we show how it was able to evolve, it actually has the streetcar that runs through that same roundabout as well. And the streetcar came well after Project 180. So it was at least a design that was adaptable. It's one that, again, it still uses the 11-foot lanes that I mentioned. It still has pedestrian walkability and safety features that are incorporated, but it's now it's a multimodal intersection, obviously, with all that different modes of traffic, including bike that's part of the bike plan as well. Agree that they're not always best in the urban core for a lot of reasons. One of the next ones that we're starting to see are on the fringes of our downtown area. But again, as we find the complex network of streets in Oklahoma City, signals are not always the answer, especially when we have a fifth or a sixth leg of traffic coming into an intersection. So I think you'll find in those cases, Oklahoma City is more opting towards a roundabout option in lieu of a signal.
There's a question from Joel. Now that the city owns the right of way for the boulevard, can it finally revert to the city's grid? I guess take it down to the city's grid and connect. And how do you go about doing so in the future?
Yeah, I think except for the grade separated section that's near Western Avenue, as much of the connections to the grid that could have been done were actually made as part of the boulevard's design. So there is connectivity, there are intersections at each of the adjacent north-south streets. So at this point, the city of Oklahoma City, do not consider the boulevard a highway. We do consider it a city street. It is now in the full possession of Oklahoma City. So we treat it the same. I don't know what additional grid connections could possibly be made at this point. I feel it's already been integrated into the grid.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the Q&A myself. I see that Aaron has asked, can you get the link to the study for the centerline stripe? You can get it in this book, Walkable City Rules, where Rule 71 is remove centerline stripes, remove centerlines on neighborhood streets. And I wanted to do a few shout outs to my most recent book, Walkable City Rules, and to my favorite recent book, which I hope all of you have read or have ordered, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer by Chuck Marone, which is just a fantastic new book that is so important. And I hope you're all reading it because you've already read Walkable City.
Let me see what else we got here. Well, somebody is asking whether you can get down to the 10-foot standard probably in Oklahoma City, given the data. That may be hard after you've just sort of adopted the 11-foot citywide, but do you ever see that changing?
One of the things I think was a blessing with the 11-foot, we integrated over 4 miles of streetcar into the downtown urban core, and it would not have worked with a 10-foot lane for the streetcar. And not knowing what the original streetcar alignment was, 10-foot would have been an issue. So, really going forward, 11-foot just works for Oklahoma City for a lot of reasons. I think, again, as we've looked at on-street parking additions and things, and the goal was to reduce the crosswalk distances in Oklahoma City. A lot of studies were done during 180. One of our local reporters who's still reporting is Steve Lackmeyer. I mean, showed some really dangerous crossings, especially along what is known as EK Gaylord in Oklahoma City, but we reduced a more than 90-foot crossing, to, I believe, something like 55 feet. And again, that was done through lane reduction, through lane width reductions. And that really was the goal in Oklahoma City, to make more walkable, safer crossings. And the 11 feet has done that. Most of our crossings are well under 50 feet. So, just dramatic changes in Oklahoma City, 22 feet at our 2-lane intersections with no turn lane.
We had some interesting questions. Has Oklahoma DOT changed their thought processes based upon the successes of Oklahoma City? I'm guessing to a limited extent, but maybe you can, or how can they be changed in the future, especially since there's been so much success with different street designs in Oklahoma City.
For the Boulevard project, which was, the project that we're talking about today, I mean, there were some initial traffic assessments done that, by reducing it from the 6 lanes to the 4, that it was likely going to fail in Oklahoma City, that we were going to have levels of service that were not acceptable when the Boulevard was opened. And I think that's what the city really challenged. With a project that had taken so long to construct, a lot of the local traffic had already rerouted. And so as we looked at kind of study figures, as we looked at future projections for traffic volume, I mean, we really stuck to a boulevard that was 4 lanes as designed. But I don't think that any of that has changed maybe how ODOT is going to design going forward. But as they work with the city on future city projects, I mean, I think that we will ask many of the same questions just based on our lessons learned in Oklahoma City, when we go through those kinds of designs. But the Boulevard was really a one of a kind. That's not a typical DOT city project for Oklahoma. I don't know of any other city in Oklahoma that's doing a similar project right now.
Maybe Jeff, I mean, how many walkability projects does a state DOT have to go through before they start to change?
What's really frustrating to me is I've done walkability studies in like 3 different Pennsylvania cities, not Philadelphia. And they're all, all these cities are essentially asking for the same thing from their state DOTs. They want to revert one-way multi-lane roads to 2-way. They want narrower lanes. Maybe they want, more frequent intersections. Maybe they want to replace signals with stop signs. And what I've never been successful in getting them to do is to get together and collectively lobby. And maybe, I don't know, Eric or maybe either of you have heard of some example, but I've not yet been successful. Obviously, I move on to the next projects and I can't be playing this role, but I've never been successful at getting a local municipality to form a kind of a class action effort against its DOT, because they all want the same things. It seems to me they'd be so much more powerful. Maybe they've been divided and conquered in such a way that they're afraid to unite, so that they, will lose out, because they might lose out to some other municipality in terms of getting a street repaved or something. But I've never been successful in seeing them do that.
I would go back just to the relationships in Oklahoma. I mean, Oklahoma City just has a really good relationship with the DOT. And when I say the DOT, we're talking about individual engineers and staff members with the Department of Transportation. And I think we choose to maintain that. So when we do have those partnership projects, we're able to have a conversation about what's best for the city on a partnership project, not necessarily what's just best for only the state. So again, we keep those active conversations going and just expect good communication to deliver great projects.
I'm going to just let people know that we're coming up on the hour, and we're going to be posting this video in a day or so. So if folks need to go at the end of an hour, and you have questions that haven't been answered, possibly they'll be answered in the next few minutes. We're going to continue to go on since we do have some more questions. There's one from James about quick build projects. I don't know if everybody's familiar with that term, but essentially transforming a street very quickly using somewhat temporary materials or semi-permanent materials often costs less. It may last several years, maybe up to 7 or 8 or 10 years. In some cases, not 30 years, but it can be done more quickly. Has that been used in Oklahoma City? Those sort of techniques? Have you considered that? You're on mute, I think.
I wasn't familiar with the term quick build, but I will share that our citizen survey in Oklahoma City has our condition of city streets as the #1 city concern. So our citizens are really looking for a lot of street resurfacing projects and those to be delivered very rapidly. We're currently resurfacing more than 100 miles of roadway in Oklahoma City each year. We're seeing our conditions dramatically increase, but one of the things that we're able to do with those is if we're scheduled for a bike lane project on that same street, we're able to, in most cases, accommodate a striping configuration or buffers or delineators at the same time that we're doing the resurfacing. So although we don't have to say the bike lane money is available, if we're already doing the street resurfacing, which is the majority of the cost, we're able to generally incorporate the bike lane project real time. We're doing a lot of those projects citywide. But for other ones that are like major street enhancement or streetscape type projects, I mean, we really are having to rely on doing more than just paint. Our preference, especially when we've tried to block out bulb outs, at intersections, is they're not as effective as when you actually build the concrete curb and gutter. So we've really opted at Oklahoma City to kind of hold out for that larger project, especially when we're looking at safety and final implementation. We've got a lot of money in our bond program right now. We have quite a bit of money in our sales tax program. So there's a lot of street enhancement projects that are full complete street projects that are currently being designed and be implemented in the next year or two.
Yeah, I see a question from Ashley, which says, I live in a neighborhood where there are no center lane stripes and people drive their cars down the middle of the street so they can feel more comfortable going faster. What can be done in a scenario like this to slow drivers down? I think the first thing I would say is don't stripe the center line, because the indication is that won't help. It's always about a perceived opportunity for conflict. The drivers will set their speed, unlike on a highway, where you set your speed based on the speed limit. In a local street, people will set their speed based on the speed at which they feel comfortable. And so the question is, what is the free space between cars parked on the other side of the road? Is parking just on one side of the road when it could be on both sides of the road? Does the road have extra space in which perhaps a bike lane could be striped, which would provide a perceptual narrowing of the street so that the cars have less space available? There's this concept of advisory lanes, which even some DOTs have been doing on more country roads, for example, in Maine, where they would take a street which is maybe 25 feet wide and stripe in which has no sidewalks or bike lanes, stripe in 2 5-foot wide zones on either side of the street so that cars are held to a 15-foot two-way area in the middle of the street, understanding that when another car approaches, they can go over the paint and into that side lane, presuming no one's in it. Anything you can do to constrict the feeling of how much room you have is going to slow cars down. And I don't know, what Eric's department will allow you to do. Some citizens just go out and stripe things themselves and see what happens.
So we don't recommend that in Oklahoma City.
I figured.
But in Oklahoma City, we do not stripe our neighborhood streets for center line. Right? We do encourage, obviously when you have a neighborhood and you might have a visitor that needs to park on the street, it really is more to make sure that there's still a passable corridor through there, even if it's for emergency vehicles. We're currently also not striping most of our collector streets as center line by choice. But again, as we get into arterial streets and the heavier traveled streets, we do find the center line is really needed for safety. But yeah, so Oklahoma City does not stripe all center lines.
It probably also has a real estate effect, because I have a brother-in-law who said, he's a real estate agent, who says that if he sees a yellow line in front of a house, he'll take a few $1,000s off of that house. The expectation, because it's not as nice as straight, there's more traffic and, faster traffic. Anthony said that there was a study that highlighted the fact that over half of the private land area in downtown Oklahoma City was devoted to surface parking. Are you seeing that the redesign of the streets and the public space is starting to spur the redevelopment of these parcels?
Oklahoma City, the reason for a lot of the vacant parcels was the urban renewal area of the late 70s and the early 80s, when I mentioned that the oil bust. We are seeing redevelopment of a lot of those sites. That started decades ago. One of the MAPS initiatives in Oklahoma City was the Maps for Kids initiative, which was a school reconstruction program. On one of those vacant parcels, a new downtown elementary school was constructed. In south of downtown, the new convention center, the new Omni Hotel have both been constructed on vacant parcels. The new Scissortail Park that we talked a little bit about early in this conversation was also constructed on many of those vacant parcels. But we continue to see redevelopment of those. It's slow, but it's sure. But we're also seeing redevelopment of existing vacant buildings as well. So there's still a vacancy rate in downtown of older buildings that have just not been occupied for a while. So it's really a mix, but not seeing a lot of construction of new surface parking lots. So there isn't a lot of new construction of surface lot. There is some structured parking that's been constructed. So there is a new garage that's been constructed adjacent to the Omni Hotel that's shared by Omni and the convention center. And there have been a few more structured parking areas that are constructed, but we're seeing most of that as a part of mixed use development in Oklahoma City and new construction by our Urban Renewal Authority.
Somebody asks about Scissortail Park and its role in revitalizing downtown. And it also integrates it seems to integrate some green infrastructure elements. Can you talk about that a little?
Sure. Scissortail Park was a part of our MAPS 3 initiative. It actually has a connecting park on the other side of the relocated Interstate 40 that's connected by the Skydance Bridge. So it's a very active park. It was purposely constructed near downtown, really to be that front lawn of the new convention center. It does have a lot of green technology built in. It has an active pond that was constructed, or a small lake that was constructed within the park. You can actually boat, rent paddle boats and things, but it actually collects all of the rainwater for the park. They use all of that stored water for the irrigation of the park as well. But many of the features of the park also just include a lot of low impact development type construction, with a lot of the plantings that are throughout the park area, with just high tolerance for drought, a lot of natural grasses, things like that. But definitely the pond is probably the most green portion of the infrastructure, with the recycled rainwater for irrigation.
I wanted to ask about the streetcar. And I don't know if you've seen that many streetcar systems that have been built lately. I don't know, maybe Jeff, you've seen some, but it seems like there's light rail, there's bus rapid transit being built, but not many streetcar systems. And I wanted to ask about the impact of that streetcar, and whether it's really had the effect that was expected. How does it fit in with public works in the streetscape?
For the Oklahoma City streetcar, again, as public works directors, it's difficult. There's a lot of infrastructure that comes with the streetcar that you just don't see above pavement. And so working the traffic signalization programs is probably the most complicated. Making sure that we've got efficiency in the route and ensuring that it is on time at the different stops simultaneously. Oklahoma City was also a city that, for a starter route, has built probably the most miles on its initial starter route than any other city in the United States. We had over 4 miles as a part of our initial construction. So when you look at other cities like Portland, their initial route, I believe, was just a little over 1 mile initially. Now I know that they've grown immensely, but we used a lot of lessons learned in our planning. But the signalization, having it to where we can cue the streetcar, where the streetcar is communicating directly with the traffic signal programs. We have a lot of difficulty, especially when it's picking up curbside, but then needs to on a 4-lane street, make a left-hand turn from that right-hand lane. So again, just a lot of the technology that's involved has been probably the most complicated for us to have it operate multimodal. But it's worked well. We've been able to integrate it fully in Oklahoma City. It connects all of our entertainment districts. It's also one that we're looking hopefully for possibly a future expansion opportunity, but I think with our lessons learned, it'll be much easier moving it forward.
And I would comment, Eric's been talking more about the functionality of it, and I think they did a great job, given the limitations that they were faced with. They did a great job at integrating it well. If you've read Walkable City, you know that I advocate for streetcars being done quite differently than the way it was done in Oklahoma City. I honestly think that, given the history of streetcars and the more recent examples of successful streetcar systems, like in Kansas City, or, most notably in Portland with the Pearl District, or the South Lake Union in Seattle, that if there aren't developers who want to pay for that streetcar because it's going to bring value to their property, or local, central business district folks who are willing to sponsor that streetcar because they understand that it's going to benefit them, then it probably doesn't make so much sense to build it. And I think that, this MAPS program has been an incredible, boon for Oklahoma City, but I would argue that it wasn't the right thing to spend their money on, and that it should have been more of a grassroots effort. And as a result, I don't think you're seeing the ridership that you would otherwise see in a streetcar that was more profit oriented from its conception.
Well, how much development has occurred as a result of the streetcar?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
How much development has occurred as a result of the streetcar?
We've seen, and there is transit-oriented development that's occurring along the route of the streetcar. I mean, obviously, that was one of the goals with anchoring in an actual rail, especially adjacent to vacant parcels. So on the north end of Broadway Avenue in Oklahoma City, there's the new Contemporary Art Museum that's been constructed. There's also been the resurgence of several new mixed-use developments along that streetcar route just due to its proximity. So we are seeing that occur in Oklahoma City. So I would say that, yes, that does work. We're seeing ridership improve. Last year was a terrible year for streetcar with pandemic and trying to get figures. But when we look at the Scissortail Park in Oklahoma City, it's pretty difficult to find a parking space within blocks of that park on a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. It's absolutely completely packed. We see a lot of the downtown venues and districts completely full of activity. But really high riderships are being seen on the streetcar during those more weekend hours. It's not a commuter rail, it's a streetcar. And so I think we just need to define the difference in those. It's not bringing in commuters from outside of Oklahoma City to work downtown. It really is just a really easy way to navigate downtown. If you're downtown, it's $1 per ride. So it's very affordable. It's air conditioned in the summer and it's heated in the winter. So it provides, again, for some escapement from the weather should you be experiencing some weather in Oklahoma City while you're traveling across downtown or into Bricktown.
And I would add, any ambivalence aside about the streetcar, that I think one of the reasons to come to Oklahoma City to be at CNU, aside from CNU itself, is where there's been a tremendous amount of successful effort is around those parks downtown, like Scissortail and others. I think Oklahoma City demonstrates really well the benefits of investing in downtown parks.
Well, and I think that's what you'll find on the streetcars, not just the transit-oriented development, but the connectivity to the Arts Museum, connectivity to a lot of the entertainment districts, the other parks, which include the Mary Botanical Gardens, the Bicentennial Park, and some of the other smaller parks too. The streetcar really was designed with a route to connect the most features as possible with that initial route. So yeah, please come enjoy in the spring and take a ride.
So we're going to have to, I guess we're going to have to call it a day here very soon, but is there any last word from you guys on Oklahoma City or what we've talked about today?
Well, I'm excited to go back. I haven't been there in many years. So I'm I've been looking at the street maps and the Google, but I'm very excited to be there. I think that there are a lot of great lessons and that it'll be a really fun CNU. So I hope that everyone who's listening will join us there.
Awesome.
And likewise, we're very receptive, looking forward to show off all of our hard work. And again, I think those that maybe have not been to Oklahoma City in a while are going to be really surprised. So appreciate the conversation today too. It's always great to catch up with Jeff and you as well, Rob. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Eric and Jeff and everybody who attended. This was a lot of fun. And so we'll talk to you soon and hopefully see everybody in Oklahoma City.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for hosting.